Listeners often ask, of all the episodes you've done, which are your favorites? Here's one that I did in the summer of 2022, and if you stick around until after the end of the main episode, I tacked on the extras portion for you to enjoy. My friend and podcast contributor Lee John Greco reported the other day that more than 14,000 complaints about smoking on CTA trains were filed through email and through the agency's chatbot over a 14-month period starting in late April 2024 and June of this year. As someone who has ridden the L with smoky patrons, it isn't pleasant. But back in the 1970s, you'd be glad if smoking was the biggest issue. Please enjoy this From the Archives episode. One man was robbed more than 190 times, knocked unconscious at least 4 times, and had an eardrum burst aboard Chicago's L, each time with Chicago cops nearby watching, all in the name of public transportation safety. This is the story of Chicago's mass transit decoy squad of the 1970s. I'm Tommy Henry, and this is the Chicago History Podcast. This episode was inspired by my pal Steve Davern's stories about his dad, Jimmy Davern. A quick overview. Chicago's public transit system includes the L, a series of elevated tracks. That's where the L comes from, some of which go underground into a subway system. For as much as the rail system in Chicago is amazing for those who need to get almost anywhere, it has, at times, had a problem with crime. Hold for gasp. Now, for all the Chicago haters and people who think anything east of LaGrange Road is downtown and that Chicago is nothing but crime, you should know that historically Chicago has seen worse times. Shootings, carjackings. There have been much, much more dangerous eras in Chicago's decades past. In the late 1960s, Chicago's rapid transit system had only a 60-man private security force. With the number of muggings, assaults, and murders climbing at an alarming rate, the Chicago Police Department stepped in, assigning a 200-man patrol to help counter criminal activity. Even with the added manpower, it is a big transit system, and criminals were getting good at being bad. Citizens started demanding better precautions be put in place to combat crime on the CTA. On May 21st, 1971, the Chicago Police Department assigned two canine units to also patrol the subway stations and platforms between 5:30 p.m. and 1 a.m. to step up protection on the CTA. That should do it, right? There was indeed a decrease in the number of crimes on Chicago's public transportation system. During the period from May 27th through June 23rd, there were 194 crimes, most of them robberies on the vehicles and properties of the CTA, down from 224 reported crimes for the period of April 29th through May 27th. While the city of Chicago was patting itself on the back for the slight reduction of crime, another high-profile incident would shock Chicago citizens and politicians and bring about the formation of the Mass Transportation Special Operations Unit. On Monday, July 5th, 1971, an 86-year-old physician named Dr. Julius Spiro left the Forum cafeteria, where he ate almost daily. While walking through the subway station near State and Washington Streets, Spiro was accosted, suffering a knife wound in the lower left side of his back. Staggering 14 feet to a cashier's window in the subway station, Spiro said to the worker, "I've been shot," before collapsing. Spiro died en route to the Henrotten Hospital, once located on Oak Street but long since demolished, where hospital employees determined the doctor had been stabbed. Julius Spiro was a practicing physician who was in the first graduating class at the University of Illinois Medical School in 1914. A noted collector of rare books and a Hebrew scholar, Spiro had practiced medicine at 55 East Washington Street for more than 50 years. Alderman Seymour Simon of the 40th Ward called Dr. Spiro's killing shocking and inexcusable, and asked the Chicago Transit Authority to demand that the City Council investigate the extent of protection of CTA patrons. Quote, "It is inconceivable that there were no police officers on the platform on a holiday weekend," Simon said. "During such times, few people are in the subway station and CTA patrons don't have the company of other riders to protect them." End quote. Spiro's attacker, a 17-year-old, was arrested within days and sentenced 1 year later to 15 to 30 years in prison for his crime. The murder of 86-year-old Dr. Spiro, who was so closely connected to Chicago, drew even more attention to the inadequacies of police on the rapid transit L system. According to then Deputy Chief of Patrol Thomas J. Lyons, quote, "Our policemen ride trains and walk platforms and give the public a rising sense of security. But uniformed police really don't stop isolated crimes. The criminal can see a man in uniform, so he doesn't commit a crime when the policeman is around. But when he catches a victim alone, his chances are good." Lyons and other police analysts pondered the problem of how to discourage muggers. Quote, "We finally got a simple idea. Make the criminal fear that the lamb he's tackling can turn out to be a tiger." End quote. The idea was to form a special operations unit of plainclothes officers who could ferret out the criminals, a decoy squad. For the record, the team was called the Mass Transit Special Operations Unit, but unless I'm quoting someone, I'm going to use the much easier to say decoy squad. Now, the idea of a decoy squad in Chicago wasn't new. One had been in use in Chicago in the early 1960s. Called the Tough Squad, Tough stood for Tactical Undercover Function. When officers joined the team, their first task was to learn karate. This next part I'm going to read as it appeared in the newspaper. After mastering the art of karate, these tough, fearless policemen become pigeons, decoys to trap would-be muggers, jack-rollers, and rapists. Shown here are 2 squad members being disguised as women, with nylons, perfume, and instructed in feminine manner of walking and smoking. Of course, I will have pictures up on the Chicago History Podcast social media pages for you to enjoy. And yes, I looked up jack-roller. It is one who robs a drunken or sleeping person. In August of 1963, the members of the Tough Squad were asking for $600 more per year, that's about $5,800 in today's money, for hazard pay. The city wouldn't budge, so the decoy squad was disbanded, and the patrolmen were transferred to 4 area headquarters around the city. Back to the summer of 1971, after Dr. Spiro's killing, Police Chief Thomas Lyons assigned 4 10-man teams of undercover policemen to patrol the rail system in disguises such as students, hippies, this was 1971 after all, and the ever-popular drunk businessmen. This would later expand to even more creative get-ups. In the 5 months before the decoy program was instituted, there were 346 robbery victims. In the 5 months after, the number fell, but only by 26 to 320. Here is the good news. In the second period, 57 of the victims, I'm using finger quotes, were decoy cops, and in all of those cases, the mugger was arrested. During an interview with the New York Daily News, Lieutenant Charles Gary, who at the time was the night commander of the Decoy Squad, showed off a map with little color-coded flags showing where and what type of crime took place. 6 of the flags represented robberies of decoys, all of which resulted in arrests, and only 3 flags were for robberies of regular folks. Quote, "We police are taking the brunt of the criminal attacks instead of citizens," according to Lieutenant Gary. The daytime commander of the squad, who would later also serve as nighttime commander, was Sergeant Clarence Kerr, who had made a name for himself in 1955 as a young patrolman looking for a 26-year-old cop killer named Richard Carpenter. During the citywide manhunt for the cop killer, Kerr spotted Richard Carpenter at the Biltmore Theater, once located at 2046 West Division Street, and when Kerr attempted to arrest him, a shootout ensued. Kerr was seriously wounded. Carpenter was later captured alive. On September 18, 1971, Patrolman James Davern joined the Decoy Squad. Less than just 2 weeks later, he made his 12th and 13th arrests the hard way. Davern was playing the role of the drunk businessman on the L platform at Lake and Cicero on the city's west side when 2 brothers in their early 20s hit him several times in the face saying, "Hey you, wake up." Davern yelled for his 5-member backup team, which turned into an all-out brawl as the 2 brothers unleashed a torrent of karate chops and kicks, all against 6 cops. 2 policemen from the Austin District Station joined in to help, and the pair of thieving martial artists were eventually subdued. In a later interview, Patrolman Davern explained how he learned his role as decoy. Quote, "When the special unit was created in 1971, I interviewed people who actually were robbed on the train. I found out what they were wearing, where they sat, who they were with. I have to be convincing or we'd never fool anyone," said Davern. Other guys on the Decoy Squad included Paul Siegfried, Siggy to his pals, who on one occasion had a disguise of a beard, mustache, mod pants, and a long trailing scarf. Siegfried wore what was described as an elegant gold wristwatch and 2 gold rings, and smelled of cheap bourbon, which he had patted on his face like aftershave lotion. Teddy Nadil, called the Gypsy because of his Latin good looks and long wavy hair, had a story he liked to tell. Quote, "I was a decoy on the L train and pulled out a lot of singles and put them in my shirt pocket. This kid, 18 years old, was breathing right down my neck. He sat down right next to me, completely unaware that there were 7 policemen all around me. 'Where did you buy your shirt?' he asked me. I couldn't believe he was going to rob me, but a second later he whipped out a pocket knife and jabbed me in the ribs, drawing blood. 7 policemen jumped on him, just like that, but the shirt he admired was ruined." Based on the stories I read, most of the decoys wore shiny watches, which often served as a lure for would-be muggers. Although most of the decoy cops were bruised or bloodied in the course of their duties, some got hurt more than others. The worst incident occurred in late July 1971 at a State Street station. 27-year-old Erwin Martin, also known as John Black, approached a decoy cop named Fred Keto with an open pocket knife. Holding the blade to Keto's stomach, Martin said, "Give me your money." Keto handed over a wallet full of marked bills and told Martin, "I'm a police officer. You are surrounded. Drop your knife." Instead of complying, Martin slashed Keto's arm, severing an artery and cutting 2 tendons. Keto drew a service revolver and fired 2 shots. Martin seemed unfazed. A 3rd shot was fired, at which point Martin fell to the ground, dead. Sergeant Kerr, Patrolman Emilio Garza, John Wright, and James Humphrey helped the injured cop to the hospital. It would later be revealed that because of his use of an alias, Erwin Martin had mistakenly been released from county jail while awaiting trial on armed robbery charges. While Fred Keto would eventually be awarded 2 police medals, the Medal of Valor for bravery and the Blue Star Medal for being seriously wounded in the line of duty, it was not long after the shooting death of Irwin Martin that Sergeant Kerr had his guys stop carrying guns while acting as decoys. Said Kerr, quote, "I believe they're a lot safer that way. After all, the muggers have the draw on them. It's up to the backup men to move fast and protect them." Jimmy Davern explained in a 1974 interview that they also didn't carry weapons because an experienced mugger might spot it. Davern added, quote, "If I get hurt, it's because of something I forgot to cover, because I was overconfident. You have to be ready for anything." While doing research for this story, I noticed there wasn't a specific area where the decoy squad focused their efforts. They seemed to show up all over the city, likely to keep muggers unsure of whether to follow through on their evil intentions. There also wasn't a consistent age of criminals. 20-somethings, 50-somethings, 40-somethings, all were getting busted by the decoy squad. One story from 1973 involved 31-year-old Thomas Wilson, who was instructing a 15- and 16-year-old boy on the fine art of the two-finger reach and the wallet twist-away, pickpocket tricks, like some modern Fagin from Dickens' Oliver Twist. Of course, the teen boys were attempting all of this on the pretending to be asleep decoy cop, Jimmy Davern, and were promptly busted. Sometimes things went wrong for the backup men. In one instance, patrolman Teddy Nadill fell asleep while acting as a decoy. One of Nadill's backup men was robbed of $3 by a mugger pretending to have a gun in his pocket. Fortunately, the other backup men swooped in and arrested the mugger. Late Wednesday, April 25, 1973, Patrolman James Davern racked up his 91st arrest. Davern and his partner were on the Wilson Avenue L platform when 40-year-old Robert Jones of the 4600 North block of Kenmore attempted to rob the plainclothes cops. Both policemen were punched in the face but subdued the assailant, who wound up at the Foster Avenue District lockup. The same police station featured prominently in episode 402 of this podcast about the Summerdale police scandal. By 1974, the decoy squad included 4 female officers, including 28-year-old Virginia Kronk, called Gus by her associates, who was new on the force. Early on a Wednesday on what we now call the Red Line, Patrolman Jimmy Davern was dressed as a businessman, pretending to be asleep when 21-year-old Louis Joe McCarthy entered the car at 35th Street. Seeing only a sleeping man on one side of the L car and a single woman on the other side, the thief thought he was in the clear. The woman, McAfee would later tell police, quote, was too pretty to be a woman cop. End quote. Close to the 12th Street station, the thief grabbed Davern's watch and took off. He didn't get far. The pretty woman was Patrolman Virginia Kronk, who jammed a .38 caliber revolver in the suspect's face and arrested him. He just couldn't believe it, Mass Transit Unit Sergeant Clarence Kerr was quoted as saying. He had never seen an undercover policewoman who was that pretty. The would-be thief's timing couldn't have been worse. The CTA station where he was arrested was a half a block from the Central Police Station at State and 11th, long since demolished. Another Virginia Kronk arrest came about when 43-year-old William Riley boarded a CTA train smoking a cigarette in violation of the no-smoking rule aboard the CTA. Kronk, in plain clothes, told Riley to put the cigarette out, but instead he chose to blow smoke in her face. He was promptly arrested. When Riley was searched, police found a carton of steaks worth about $300 stolen from a restaurant where the offender worked. See, kids, smoking really is bad for you. One of the most theatrical decoy cops? That would be Arthur Novitt. When Novitt died in 2012 at the age of 89, Chicago Sun-Times writer Maureen O'Donnell explained why in his obituary. While Novid often disguised himself as a country bumpkin or a vagrant to attract robbers, it was when he donned a Superman costume that helped Novid earn the nickname Superman of the Subway. To really amp up the Superman angle, he and his fellow police officers would pull the pins on doors of CTA storage closets. When a robber tried to steal anything from the decoy cop lying on the platform like a man on a bender, the Superman of the Subway would come blasting through the door, which would go flying like his comic book counterpart, loudly proclaiming, "Halt in the name of the law! Law and order will prevail in the subways of Chicago. As long as I'm in this metropolis, law and order will prevail." When the judge asked the robbers who took them down, one responded, "Superman arrested me." The judge allegedly sent him for a psychological evaluation. According to Novid's wife, quote, "He used to dress up like a cowboy, like he just came from Texas. He had fake mustaches, he had fake sideburns, he put powder in his hair so it looked gray." Arthur Novid was so convincing at disguising himself that a neighbor came by one day to tell him about all the strange men going in and out of his house. Novid thought that this was so funny, he didn't even try to explain the truth, usually responding, "Thanks for telling me." By October of 1974, the Decoy team was getting on in years, at least for this kind of work. Davern was 42, and many of the other guys on the team were getting close to about the same age. Oh, I almost forgot. The Decoy Squad was such a big deal, veteran Chicago newsman John Drury featured their story on a 1974 episode of Eyewitness Chicago. According to the synopsis, John Drury spends a night with Chicago Police Tactical Unit D, the mass transit decoy squad, to show how Officer James Davern poses as a drunk to attract and arrest robbers who prowl the city's CTA trains and stations. According to Sergeant Clarence Kerr, crime on CTA trains had been cut in half since the Special Decoy Unit was instituted. It seems word got around to the would-be muggers that the person they were thinking about robbing aboard an L just might be a cop. The Mass Transit Squad was disbanded in 1975 with the officers returning to regular duties. Chicago in the mid-70s was experiencing a rash of arson fires, and to combat this problem, the city needed the right guy for the job. They brought in Sergeant Jimmy Davern as unit leader. Chicago's arson stories will have to wait for a future episode. Davern was later appointed by Mayor Jane Byrne as parking chief at O'Hare Airport. In April of 1989, then Police Superintendent Leroy Martin requested a new decoy unit be formed to combat muggings and thefts on Chicago's transit system. The new unit's name? The Crime Assault Team. This was the third time a decoy unit was formed in Chicago in 40 years, and who better to help train the officers than Sergeant James Dolan and Officer John Neary of the 1960s Tough Squad and Jimmy Davern from the 1970s Mass Transit Special Operations Team. Jimmy Davern's words of advice in 1974 about taking public transportation still hold true now. Back then he said, quote, "There's safety in numbers. They should always sit near somebody, even if it's someone they don't know. And be alert. These people, meaning robbers, are bullies. They like to pick on defenseless people who are tired or who have had too much to drink." Chicago has continued to see crime on public transportation since the 70s, but with more than 33,000 cameras installed on buses and the rail system, many of them high definition, there are more eyes than ever watching at all times. According to the Transit Chicago website, since 2011, this network of security cameras have aided police in the arrest of roughly 200 persons each year. In 2020, Chicago's Police Department launched the new Strategic Decision Support Center, which gives officers access to the network of cameras, which in turn helps them monitor incidents and respond more quickly. Still, with all this technology, I think I'd prefer to have a guy sitting behind me who looks like a passed-out businessman or a country bumpkin or a meat butcher, ready to pounce when danger is present. You know, someone like Jimmy Davern. Thanks for listening to this episode about Chicago's mass transit decoy squad of the 1970s. This episode was researched, written, recorded, and edited by me, Tommy Henry. Special thanks to Steve Davern for sharing the stories about his dad, Jimmy Davern, and for giving me access to the binder of press clippings. If you have questions about anything covered today, anything to add, or have an idea for a future episode, I'd love to hear about it. And I do mean here. You can leave me a voice message just by going to chicagohistorypod.com and clicking on the microphone in the lower right corner. Depending on the content of your message, I may play it on a future episode, so keep it clean. That stellar art for the podcast you see used on the Chicago History Podcast social media pages was created by the fertile mind of John K. Schneider. If you need art for your project, reach out to John at Angel Eyes Art, JKS on Instagram, or via email at angeleyesartjks@gmail.com. I will be back soon with more stories from Chicago's history. Until then, get out and explore when possible. Just be aware of your surroundings. Learn more about whatever city you live in, and stay safe. Here are some extras that didn't make the final cut in episode 513 about the mass transit decoy squad of the 1970s. Please have a listen to that full-length episode first, otherwise the following may not make much sense. And if for some super weird reason this is the first ever episode you're listening to, I'm Tommy Henry, the creator and host of the Chicago History Podcast. Enjoy. In October of 1962, the Chicago Tribune ran a story in their Sunday magazine section titled "Death Rides a Flash of Steel," which underneath read, "When a knot of fear tightens in a cop's stomach, it's not because he doesn't know what to expect, it's because he does." In the magazine story, it discussed how the city was under the threat of a wave of vicious strong-arm taxi robberies. One decoy, Sergeant Lenny Knoll, volunteered to drive a cab on the city streets and ended up getting in 2 fights for his life. In one of those fights, he shot and killed his attacker. After that incident, the number of taxi robberies decreased. In one picture in the article, Sergeant Alvin Scholl staggers up a stairwell pretending to be drunk. Sergeant Dick McCurry, these are all very cool cop names, who helped develop the early 1960s decoy squad with Scholl, was quoted as saying, "There's a lot of ham in all of them. There's also a lot of guts." The undercover cops were so good at playing seedy characters, they were often picked up by other cops. Quote, "It happens all the time," said one undercover cop, "and although it can be annoying, it's always comforting to know we haven't lost our touch." Back in early 1963, there was a documentary shown on WGN-TV Channel 9 called Tough Guys. Tough, of course, spelled T-U-F. Billed as a, quote, factual drama about Chicago Police Department's tactical undercover function, end quote. To make it even more Chicago, it was sponsored by Sears, Roebuck & Company, the department store chain founded here in Chicago. I would love to see this documentary, but have been unable to track it down, so if any of you helpful listeners have it or have a lead on it, please reach out to me. If you listen to the full episode, you heard me talk about the stabbing murder of 86-year-old Dr. Julia Spiro in one of Chicago's subways. It would later be revealed that one day after Dr. Spiro's assault, his assailant, 17-year-old Lester Davenport, was burglarizing the apartment of 41-year-old Nellie Salisbury, a mother of 6, in the 9600 block of South Halsted when Salisbury returned home. Startling her intruder, Mrs. Salisbury was stabbed in the chest. Neighbors who heard the woman's screams called police, who found Lester Davenport in an alley at 97th and Halsted. In his possession was a 7-inch pocket knife. Salisbury was taken to Little Company of Mary Hospital, where she identified Lester Davenport as her attacker. Davenport, a parolee from the suburban St. Charles Training School for Boys, recanted his confession, claiming he was under the influence of drugs and didn't know what he was doing. A little more than a year after the slaying of Dr. Julia Spiro and the stabbing of Nellie Salisbury, Lester Davenport was sentenced to serve from 15 to 30 years in prison for the slaying of Spiro. Davenport was also sentenced to 10 to 14 years for the attempted murder, aggravated battery, and attempt in robbery of Mrs. Salisbury. I received 2 messages from relatives of Dr. Spiro about the podcast episode, and they both agreed to let me include them here.
This is Larry Serlin. I'm leading this message regarding episode 513 concerning the Chicago Mass Transit Decoy Squad. My great-uncle was Julius Spiro. I didn't know until listening to this episode that his death had resulted in the formation of a special unit on the CTA. I'm glad that there was a positive consequence to this tragic incident.
My name's Lori Levin. Thank you for the podcast regarding the murder of my great-uncle, Julius Spiro. This had a big impact on our family. I was a child who had just seen him the day before. The offender, although he pled guilty at the preliminary hearing, was released in a little over 10 years, somewhere between 10 and 15 years. Thank you again, and keep doing what you're doing. Bye-bye.
Thanks to you both for reaching out to me. Your great-uncle sounds like he was an amazing man who deserved a better ending to his life, and messages like this make my efforts in creating this podcast even more worthwhile. While the stabbing death of Dr. Spiro was the incident that made the city and the police department take action to counter the crime on the CTA with the introduction of the Decoy Squad, city officials were certainly aware of the problem long before then. In addition to outside criminals causing trouble on the public transit system, there were also criminals on the inside. On June 3rd, 1971, the Chicago Tribune ran a front-page story about several Chicago Transit Authority employees who had been linked to a bandit ring called the Sky Riders. According to the Chicago police and CTA officials, this gang was suspected of committing hundreds of robberies during the previous year on L trains and platforms. The story claimed 7 suspected members of the gang had already been arrested, with 19 more being sought. One gang member turned informant detailed the gang's operations, which normally took place between 10:30 p.m. and 4 a.m., Both CTA conductors and ticket agents would serve as lookouts for robbers, warning them if police were in the area or riding trains. Some gang members were so well known to CTA employees that they wouldn't have to pay to ride the L, and often the robbers' best customers for goods stolen aboard the L trains were the CTA employees themselves. In the first 4 months of 1970, there were 490 crimes on the CTA. The same period 1 year later reflected 900 crimes. See, they needed Jimmy Davern and the Decoy Squad much earlier than anyone let on. Virginia Cronk, one of the few female officers on the Decoy Squad, showed up in the news a few more times in her career. In one instance, 43-year-old William Riley boarded an L train smoking a cigarette in violation of the CTA's no-smoking rule. Officer Cronk, in plain clothes, asked Riley to put out the cigarette. Instead, Riley blew smoke in Cronk's face. Officer Cronk arrested Riley, and when he was searched, police found a carton of steaks worth about $600, which Riley had stolen from a restaurant where he worked. In another story, Virginia Cronk and fellow police officer Nancy Sticilo posed as clients to bust a faith healer. Police were alerted by two 22-year-old women who claimed 54-year-old Christos Euthymiou took liberties with them. Cronk and Sticilo posed as clients visiting the faith healer, I'm using finger quotes here, at his office home on West Leland Avenue in Lincoln Square. Each woman paid $20 for a 1-hour session. It didn't take long before Euthymiou began fondling and kissing the undercover cops as part of what he called, quote, laying on of the hands, end quote. During the ritual, Euthymiou was arrested and transported to the Belmont area lockup. December 10th, 1971, Decoy Squad member James Humphrey was on the L station at North and Clybourne, lying on the platform, pretending to be passed out. Michael Gully, 23, of the 1100 block of South Kildare, approached Humphrey and kicked him in the leg. Seeing no response, Gully removed Humphrey's watch and some money. Gully began to walk away, then turned and kicked Humphrey in the face with such force, quote, if his head were a football, it would have carried 60 yards. Gully then kicked Patrolman Humphrey in the stomach, and while Humphrey was doubled over, screaming for backup, Gully stomped on his right hand with enough force as to break it. Kenneth McCann, a Decoy unit sergeant, arrested Gully with the help of two other unit members, using force when Gully resisted arrest. Both Decoy Squad member James Humphrey and offender Gully were admitted to Henrotten Hospital, long gone, where both were listed in fair condition. Gully was charged with assault, strong-arm robbery, and resisting arrest. I was thrilled to learn Paul Siegfried, one of the remaining Decoy Squad members, long retired and living in Wisconsin, heard the podcast episode about himself and his old crew. I found another mention of Siggy, as he was known. One night not far from the Rush Street nightclub district, Paul Siegfried was slumped on the stairs of a subway station, reeking of booze. According to the newspaper article, quote, Siegfried is an inventive man who has been known to borrow his 6-year-old son's beanie, a tasseled one, to impersonate a football fan, drowning his sorrows, end quote. Anyone who has supported the Chicago Bears over the years knows that isn't much of a stretch. When it came time to prosecute offenders, Patrolman Jimmy Davern said this, quote, whenever I get robbed, Davern said, we recover the property, our evidence, from the assailant no more than 10 or 15 feet away from me. If there was ever anything such as an airtight case, this is it, end quote. In addition to acting as decoys, the Mass Transit Special Operations Unit had a keen eye for spotting potential robbers, following their intended victims from the train, often making an arrest before a civilian got hurt. Unfortunately, many of those arrests of the early 1970s did not lead to convictions because the victims were not willing to take the time to testify against their muggers. According to James Davern, quote, apathy of the victims is the biggest problem we have, end quote. I talked a lot in the main episode about Chicago cop Jimmy Davern, so instrumental in the effectiveness of the Mass Transit Special Operations Unit, aka the Decoy Squad. You'd think that guys willing to take risks like these were likely single and didn't have anyone waiting at home for them. On the contrary, Jimmy Davern was married, raising 3 sons and 2 daughters while he was risking his neck to keep Chicago safe. When Davern's wife's sister died, the couple even took in the sister's 2 young daughters. When I asked his son Steve if it was strange to have his dad come home all banged up, he said, quote, we knew what he did for a job. It seemed normal to us. Jimmy Davern passed away in 2003 at the age of 71. In his obituary, it read, in part, quote, cherished friend and pal to many, he will be greatly missed, end quote. Jimmy Davern and the rest of the Decoy squad certainly made their families and Chicago proud. There you go, some extras for all of you who enjoyed the full-length episode. I hope you enjoyed these added bits. Thanks for listening.